front and center, and all you really have to do is ask for them, and they end up in your hand.
All right, cool.
So that is what hosting's job is, to locate this, and then your program puts whatever handler it wants on there. And this would be, add MVC, or this is, the Hello World example.
The Hello World example.
And then that's all there is to it. That's hosting's job. If you are hosting in IIS or on HTTP/sys, the same DLL is going through that code path. So IIS gives control to hosting, which locates the startup class in the same way. So whether you're self-hosted or IIS hosted, the execution path is as similar as possible.
Okay, let's switch back to the slides and talk just briefly about Kestrel, and then in the context of potentially other places that we could host this stuff.
Sure.
Well, Kestrel is just something that you kind of slapped together that suddenly people started using.
Well, it's been kicking around for a little bit.
Did you expect it to be anything more than like a kind of a, here, this is the little thing I built? Or did you intend to go and build a managed web server that people would really start using?
Both. It started off as a exercise in getting code that was sort of running the same everywhere, and also it's something that, and it wasn't just me. Lots of people have been like asking for this and pushing for it, and Fowler has been on the Twitters, asking people, where is the managed HTTP server for .NET?
Right.
Java's got Jetty. These other things have like purely managed HTTP servers. What does the community think of that? Who wants to start running one? And so there were some people that were working on that already. This one is coming together. It's based on libof and
libuv,
yes.
libuv. That's the one that Node uses.
Yep. So it's using the libuv evented socket API libraries, and so that's how it's talking to the internet. Other than that, it is basically doing the HTTP framing. So to be an HTTP server, you have to understand the request and you have to serialize the response. Other than going through all of the things to make it production-ready and trustworthy computing, and that huge bar, Microsoft sets a huge bar for what it considers to be production server. Other than that, HTTP itself is a fairly basic protocol. Once you get the framing and the bodies out of the way.
Sure.
All you have to do is transceive things. At that point, you have a managed code HTTP server. You can use it from a host process on Windows. And on Windows, you can choose between HTTP/sys and Kestrel. And if you are going cross-platform, you can take your server with you. You obviously don't have IIS available, but you can run a process. And once you're in that process, you can boot whichever web server you want to.
How complicated is Kestrel? Like, how much code are we talking about here? Like, does it make it easier to get it past trustworthy computing because there's not a lot of code?
Trustworthy computing, they have extremely specific and very sophisticated things they look for. OAuth attacks, bad data, how, protocol vulnerabilities, everything that you can think of. So being simple helps, but being simple isn't enough. There's a lot of things that I couldn't even, begin to enter into.
So it's going through that process?
Yes, and it will need to be through that process before it's called anything close to production ready.
And arguably, do you think it'll make it through that process, and it'll be something that people could have as an option?
Oh yeah, someday. Yeah, someday certainly. Yes.
So then, when someone is putting a Node application live in production, they're not necessarily they're going to run Node.exe, but they're not going to take that port and put it out into the real world. They're going to front it with something.
Oh yeah. You'll definitely think twice before making Node your front-end server. You will. As often as not, and I don't know what the percentages are, but I think it's at least half of the instances will have Nginx or some sort of HTTP front server, often configured to do the static files, to take that load off of the Node process itself, but also because it can be considered in some ways a more robust server for some of the attacks that you can do on an HTTP sort of like socket.
So the kind of stuff like people ask themselves, like, what exactly does IIS do? It does the static file, it does the different routing from requests from different kinds of. It's a component container, lifecycle management, all that kind of stuff. In the Unix world, sometimes you'll take 2 or 3 different utilities that will do that kind of work. So then, would you anticipate when someone says something like, some of these simple tweeted questions, how do I run ASP.NET applications on Apache? That's going to be a more complicated question about like, well, how do I have Apache as my front web server doing the static files with then brokered calls over to Kestrel, some future version of Kestrel. We're going to have to come up with a prescription for that.
Oh yeah, yep, and probably really good examples in articles. Assuming that they reach the point where they're production ready, and you kind of have that experience like you alluded to with a different technology. If you search for how do I put Nginx in front of Node, you find a lot of articles, and then you find you basically pick the one that makes the most sense to you and seems like the stablest source, and then follow them like a script.
Yeah, I think people have been a little spoiled because things like IIS can be put right on the front end, or things like Apache can be put right up there. But now you've got Nginx and other firewalls and other things like Redis and Mongo and all these different things. And some people put them out there on the open internet, and some people don't.
Well, and the fact of the matter is that when you're talking about cloud hosting, even if you do run a process that is its own web server, you are virtually never the front server that's on the edge of the internet.
That's true.
You're almost always behind at least a network appliance and often a routing layer.
Yeah, which protects you from a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, a whole category of attacks,
Yeah, you don't want to be on the open internet.
No, at least not without the right tools.
Yeah. Cool. Well, we have been learning all about ASP.NET internals from Louis DeJardin. You can check him out at where'slou.com, as well as follow him on Twitter. And we will be back talking to Rowan Miller and talking about the Entity Framework 7. And we are back. Last but not least, Entity Framework.
Hopefully
data.
not least. Yeah.
So no, absolutely not least, because none of it, you can't do anything without data.
That's true. Yep.
See? So you're really first.
Yep, absolutely.
We're here with Rowan Miller, and we're here on the Microsoft Virtual Academy. We're going to get the scoop on what's going on with Entity Framework 7.
Absolutely.
So who are you?
So I'm Rowan Miller. I work on the Entity Framework team here at Microsoft. I'm a program manager, which means I fill in the gaps for anything that needs doing, as most people who are here today. Focused mainly on Entity Framework, but have a bit to do with everything around the shop. We all work as part of the ASP.NET team as well here. Prior to Microsoft, I worked doing application integration in the enterprise before coming here. And if you want to catch me blog, I blog often at rowmiller.com.
Yeah. All right. Cool. And that's still me?
Yep, nothing's changed.
Nothing's
I assume
changed. I'm
since
still
an
the
hour
guy
ago.
who's got his own slide for no reason at all.
Very good.
All right, cool. So EF.
Yeah.
EF7.
So kind of got 3 sections to the talk today. We're going to do a few slides just to talk about what EF7 is all about. Then we're going to do one set of demos, which just looks at basic data access using Entity Framework 7. It's kind of the don't freak out, the world hasn't changed demo. And then after that, we'll dig in and have some demos of new features and cool stuff you can do with EF7.
Okay.
Sound good?
Cool.
So EF7, kind of the tagline we use for it is new platforms and new data stores, which sounds great, but I'll spend a little bit of time in a couple of slides talking about what that actually means. So in terms of new platforms, EF has always worked when you target the full .NET framework, WPF, WinForms, ASP.NET vCurrent, etc. Starting in EF7, we're going to be targeting Windows Phone, Windows Store. So this is primarily about local data access. Obviously, on devices, SQLite is the go-to database there, so that would kind of be our default story on Phone and Store. But the full provider model's there, so if we want to target something else on Phone and Store, that would be possible too. In addition, obviously, ASP.NET 5, which is why I'm here today. That includes full .NET Framework and targeting the new core CLR. And then, of course, as we're going cross-platform, we're also going to be able to use EF in your Mac and Linux applications as well.
And presumably to talk to both SQLite and SQL Server proper?
Yeah, absolutely. And then obviously on Mac and Linux, kind of the default environment is looking at something like PostgreSQL, so we'll be looking at providers for that as well. So I should mention, this is the core of Entity Framework, supports all these different platforms, but what specific providers are available will depend on what APIs are available on those platforms. Obviously, a lot of providers have some native dependencies, for example, SQL Server, so that may not be available on all platforms. But the core of EF and everything that's kind of baked in will work across this full set of platforms. So then the other half of the equation is new data stores. So historically, EF was all about targeting relational databases, but in EF7, we're opening that up to work with non-relational databases as well. Now, when most people hear this, they kind of freak out and think, oh no, another high-level framework that works great in demos, but falls apart as soon as I try and do anything.
That is kind of what they think.
Yeah, so EF7, we're definitely not building some kind of magical abstraction. The goal is not that you can write some code and have it run on a key value store and a relational database and a document database. the idea is we take the services that make sense on almost all databases, like the unit of work pattern, link queries, change tracking, mapping to POCO types, that kind of stuff. That's kind of baked into the core of EF. And then as you target a specific database, we'll pull in extra extensions that give you the additional capabilities of that. So for example, targeting a relational database, I get the ability to set up cascade delete and things like that. If I target Azure Table Storage, I can set up my row and partition key for the model. And obviously, if I target a relational database, I get additional transaction APIs for working with DB transaction, things like that. Some examples of providers we're working on, obviously SQL Server, that's our bread and butter relational data store. I mentioned SQLite because that's really important for phone, store, device. Azure Table Storage and Redis were just some proof of concept ones we did. And then we're also working on an in-memory database, which is useful when you want a unit test. I should also add to the list, we've done a little bit of work with other people outside of our team on providers for DocumentDB and also for MongoDB as well. So we're kind of exploring, playing around with a whole bunch of different ideas. Now, not all of these are going to ship at our initial release. This is the list that our team is working on, but we've kind of at this stage put Azure Table Storage and Redis to one side while we focus on shoring up SQL Server as our top priority. So you don't expect all this stuff to be RTM quality at the same time. Okay, so that's where we're headed with EF7. Let's talk about how we're going to achieve it. So EF7 is a lightweight and extensible version of EF. We'll dig into what this means. This is somewhat akin, I think the ASP.NET lightweight and extensible aren't the words we use, but we use modular.
Well, does it imply that EF6 is not lightweight or extensible?
Yes, I think it does. Bits of EF6 are extensible. So if you look at things like command interception, which was something we introduced in EF6, we have a common extensible component that we go through whenever we talk to the database. But 98% of the EF code base was written a long time ago. It wasn't factored well, and it doesn't lend itself to being extensible. But also doesn't really lend itself to being lightweight. You get all of EF in memory at the same time.
So it seems like EF7 is to 6 as ASP.NET 5 is to 4. Like you've broken it all apart, make it as lean and mean as possible.
Yeah, exactly.
And
So
modular.
the title I had for this next slide is EF7 is Part V7 because, as we're going to see in a minute, it very much is a continuation of Entity Framework, but it's also Part V1 because in some cases we're kind of doing away with some of the baggage from our past releases and building things the way we would like them to be built.
I see.
Started now.
So like ASP.NET 5, it's an appropriate reboot with concept compatibility, but also
Absolutely.
in some places all new stuff.
Yeah, and that, I think concept compatible is very important. I mean, it sounds like a cheesy marketing line, but it's something we care passionately about.
As long as it's true,
Yeah, and
then
it
it's
is.
not a cheesy marketing line.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, EF6.x codebase, we just had a lot of baggage in there. It wasn't well factored, so we had to look at a bit of a reboot. And as you mentioned, ASP.NET 5 coming out was a really good time to do it, as we're already rebooting other parts of the stack as well. So concept compatible in the sense, same top-level experience, so you still get DB context, you still get DB set, but under the covers are built over a much more lightweight and extensible core, which is similar to everything we've talked about today for ASP.NET 5.
Okay, but I know how to do DB context and DB set, and I know how to do code first.
Absolutely.
And I can take existing databases and make code first models, so it'll feel comfortable.
Yes, absolutely. We want you to start and very much feel like you're working with Entity Framework.
Okay, cool.
We're not pulling everything forwards. EF has brought a lot of baggage with it. There's a lot of stuff you could do, but almost nobody ever did. Some examples were just very complex mapping scenarios that were possible. You could mix table per hierarchy and table per type and table per concrete type, inheritance mapping, all into the one inheritance hierarchy. And this was just stuff people very rarely did, and it made the whole code base very complicated. We'll see an example in code in a minute. We also had the ability to a feature called MEST, or multiple entity sets per type, which is supported in the core of EF and relates to reusing the same CLR type to map to different instances of a table. Hasn't been supported ever in the DB context API, and so you had to drop down to object context, and we've just found nobody ever complained about the fact it was missing from DB context because nobody uses it.
And what was it called?
Called MEST, multiple entity sets per, exactly.
Yeah, that's a good reason to get rid of it.
Yeah. I should also note, obviously we're shedding a bit of baggage. That gives us a bit of room to pull in some new features people have been asking for. So stuff like batching updates. When you call save changes, we don't do one round trip to the database for every row that you're inserting or adding now. And we'll look at a few other ones as well when we're going into demos. Now, the one somewhat controversial point we have is that in EF7 we've made the call to just bring forward code-based modeling. Now, when we first started talking about this, we called this we're only bringing code first forwards, which of course everyone thinks, well, I write my classes and I generate my database and freak out because I work in an enterprise where I have existing databases.
Exactly.
Code-based modeling is about having a model expressed in code rather than XML. You can create your model and have a database generated for you, and then update it with migrations, or you can start with an existing database and have it generated into a model, which you can then tweak to match how you want your domain classes.
What does this mean for people who have, quote unquote, invested in large designer-made models? Where does the intellectual property lie?
So that's actually a really good question. There's 2 data points I would put on here. One is that right now, EF7, we're not selling it as a replacement for EF6. You know, EF7, it's kind of part v1. We're going to keep investing in EF6 for a while. I know Microsoft says that a lot, but you can go and see that that's reality now. We've been working on EF7 for about a year, and you can see we've done incremental updates. We've done EF6.1, 6.1.1, 6.1.2. That was all done at the same time we were working on the EF7 code base. So we're actually adding features, fixing things, taking community contributions. So you can stay on EF6 and still be supported for a while. Obviously, it's not going to be forever, but
well, it's like web forms. People keep asking about what web forms means in the context of ASP.NET 5. We're still putting cool stuff into web forms. We just added async and async model binding.
Exactly.
We've added new stuff to web forms going forward. So, it's a fork.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and it's going to take a bit of time for EF7 to have all of the rich capabilities that 6 had. Some of them are going to look a bit different. So for some people upgrading, we wouldn't recommend that you go and take an existing big EF6 app and try and upgrade it to EF7. Definitely not now. Probably not in 6 months. Maybe in 12 months. Be the time to start thinking about that. All right. So here was an example. Folks can say, well, you were doing a lot of good stuff in EF6. It was a bit slow. Could you improve the performance? But does it really justify a rewrite? So I wanted to look, obviously at the heart of an ORM is saying, well, I've got this ELR class. I want to go and find out what table it maps to. So you would think the core of an object relational mapper would be optimized for finding out what table a class maps to. So here's the code from EF6. As you can see, it's not exactly intuitive. A whole bunch of stuff going on there. Aside from this being horrible to work out how to write, it's also very slow because our stack has to do this over and over again. If we contrast that with EF7, it's very simple. We're basically saying, pull up the metadata you have for the entity type. I want to get the relational parts of the metadata you have and just show me the table it maps to. Now, to be fair, a CLI class can map to multiple different tables. We could have some properties in one table, some in another. So,
but when I see a before, this is a before and after?
Yes.
Like when I see a before and after like this, what are you supposed to, I'm not sure what I'm emotionally supposed to do with this slide.
You're supposed to
on the
say-
left, I'm like, well, what were you thinking?
Yeah.
But on the right, I'm thinking, is it really that easy? Like, that can't be right.
So if you operate in a domain where you know that your class is mapped to one table, which is 99, probably 90-something% of applications out there, then the code is really this simple. This is literally taken from an application I wrote.
But oftentimes I'll have like a view model where I'm trying to get a model out of the database where a couple of tables are going to come out and I want to join them together into either a view model or what's close to a view model, a data transfer object that's well on its way to becoming a view model.
Yeah, so the way this API works here, but things are basically stored as annotations within the metadata. So we have a core which doesn't really know anything about tables or columns because those don't apply on all data stores. And this is some Sugar APIs, extension methods basically, over the top of that metadata saying, give me the relational metadata and then give me the table from that. Now, obviously, if I was mapping to multiple tables, then the API gets a little bit more complicated. There'd probably be a Boolean flag. I can test whether it maps to multiple tables or not. But,
I see.
this code on the left is actually from one of the most popular, I just copied it from one of the most popular posts I've done on my blog, because people want to know how to do this stuff, and obviously it's extremely unintuitive.
Yeah. With all due respect.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you don't have to respect me because nobody on our
Yeah, I don't know how. I mean, the third line kind of makes sense, but the rest of it, I don't think I could do.
Yeah, I think I get lost halfway through the first line. So.
Well, you wrote it.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yep. No. All right. So that's enough talking about it. Let's
see some code.
Some stuff. So, like I said, this first demo, I'm going to look at what does normal data access look like with EF7.
Sure.
And kind of subtitle this the Don't Freak Out demo because stuff looks pretty similar. So. Here I have a simple ASP.NET 5 application. It's an MVC app. It's basically empty. I've got a bunch of boilerplate code to have MVC working, and I've started padding out a model. In here, as part of the default project templates, I have Entity Framework installed.
Okay.
So you'll see here I have Entity Framework.SQL7 NuGet package. This is one important thing to point out. Historically, if you install the Entity Framework package, that was kind of Entity Framework plus everything to make SQL Server work because we're Microsoft and we ship SQL Server. Things are a bit better factored now, so the core is completely data store agnostic. You would typically install a package for the provider you want to use. So you'd install entity framework.sql server, .sqlite, .azure table storage.
I see. And then so you have the entity framework, the core, and then the plugin.
Exactly, yeah. And then here's another plugin too. So obviously when you installed the entity framework package, you also got the migrations commands. Now you get those by installing entity framework.commands.
Oh, so those are separate. So migrations are optional.
Yeah, and I don't have to deploy them, right? I might just use them locally, but I don't need to deploy the package with my PowerShell commands in it.
How would you express that, given what we've learned about ASP.NET 5?
So this would be a dev time dependency, or whatever we're calling that feature now.
Ah, okay.
I don't necessarily have to go and deploy all this stuff to my production server.
You would exclude it from being published.
Exactly.
Okay.
And like we said, this is kind of a little bit under the covers. If you just create a new ASP.NET 5 from the project template, then you get all this stuff pre-installed and you're ready to go. All right, so I've kind of written some boilerplate code to get us started. I have a simple POCO class here called Bike. This is a cycle sales company. They sell bicycles. They keep a database with some inventory and product catalog, etc. I've started a cycle sales context here. You'll notice this looks very much like EF6. We inherit from DB context. This class represents our session with a database.
Yep.
We expose a DB set for each type in our model, allows us to query and save instances of the types. First thing I'm going to look at is something that is a little bit different. We made it easier to do code-based configuration. So in EF6, you would have this separate DB configuration object, and there was some stuff you could set, some stuff you couldn't set, and there was one of them globally for all your contexts. We now have an onConfiguring method that you can override. This is somewhat akin to the onModel creating method we have. When you want to configure the model, this helps you configure the context.
Does onModel creating still exist?
Yes, it does. We'll actually see that a little bit later. So I get this options thing come in, and what I get on here is really some extension methods. So I've got use SQL Server as one of those extension methods, and that's available because I have the SQL Server package installed. If I only had SQLite installed, I would just say use SQLite instead.
Is this similar to the similar model to the way ASP.NET says use this or use that?
Yeah, this is similar to kind of code you'd write in startup.cs where different things light up when you have packages referenced.
Okay.
We're going to say use SQL Server. Now, obviously, in my context code isn't necessarily the best place to put my connection string, so we're going to look at where we can move this to later. But for the moment, I'm just going to pull in a SQL connection string from a code snippet. I'm cheating. So we're targeting SQL Express. I'm targeting a database on there called Cycle Sales. And I've just switched on integrated authentication for that. So this is essentially all I need to do to get my model up and running. Now, one thing we have changed in EF7 is that we don't do any magic database creation. You might remember from EF6, you could write a model and press F5, and it would magically create a database for you somewhere.
Which worked most of the time, but then if you deleted the database, sometimes you got yourself into weird situations.
Yeah. And if you were a first-time user coming to it and you pressed F5, you're like, well, that's great, it worked, but where the heck's my database?
Yep.
All those kind of things. So we're trying to make things much more explicit. We also found with that, we kind of lead people off down a path that looked all pretty and nice, and then they would want to change their model, and it's like, oh, well, sorry, you actually wanted the path back down there. So you've got to go unlearn some of the stuff you learned and then head back off down a different path.
Okay.
So all that to set up that essentially migrations are part of the default experience now. So I want to create a database based on my model. So I'm going to load up Package Manager console. Now, everything I'm doing here is just from a command line. I just like having my command line in my IDE. So I happen to be using Package Manager console here. But
before, people were typing things like enable migration and add migration, and it had to happen in Package Manager console.
Yep. So outside of ASP.NET 5, we still have all those commands available in Package Manager console. And that's just because currently in ASP.NET 5, there's no integration between the project system and Package Manager console. But if you're writing a phone app or a store app or WinForms, whatever, you have the same add migration and update database commands you had before.
Okay.
But underneath that, we actually also have a command line, which will work as well. So you can get the extra sugar of Package Manager console if you want. You don't have to. You can just use a command line as well.
And is it me typing KEF?
Yeah, so let's look at that. So because I'm just using this as a command line, it's not really getting any context about my projects or whatever. So I'm going to cd into the actual folder that my project is in on disk. Okay. And then we'll do KEF. And we'll see it's going to print out the list of entity framework commands along with a
nice. I haven't seen the ASCII unicorn.
Yeah, it's nice, hey? And remember from the previous sessions, I can't remember who it was, but someone showed this. If we go look in Project JSON, I'm getting EF here because it's listed under the command section in my Project JSON.
Ah.
And it's basically forwarding on to the entity framework.commands package that I have installed.
And we can make that could be DB or whatever.
Yeah, you can rename it if you want.
Foo. Yep. Got it.
Now we've also tweaked things a little bit for the K version of these. They're a little bit more K-ish to kind of align with the rest of the commands. So I do KEF, I want to work with migrations, so I type migration. Type add, because I want to add a new migration.
Okay.
And I get to give this thing a name, so I'm just going to call it initial schema, but I could type anything in here.
Will there be tooling to do this?
Not yet.
Have you thought about if there should be?
We have, actually when we initially did migrations, we kind of started with the command line experience and assumed we were going to do tooling. And then everyone seemed to be really happy with the command line experience, so we never got around to doing the tooling. We hear every now and then from somebody who wants it, but for the most part, people seem to be really happy with the command line experience. That said, I think we might still end up doing it. It would be nice to have a little window in VS that says, oh, I noticed you've got a pending migration.
Sure.
Click this button to
Let's see what it looks like.
So we'll go ahead and scaffold out. And I use the word scaffold intentionally. This code is designed to be scaffolded code that you would own and edit. We don't always get migrations right. It's kind of EF taking a guess at what you want to do. So you'll notice the migrations folder just popped up.
This is very similar to the way it was before.
Exactly, yeah. You'll notice in ASP.NET we don't nest designer files just yet, but so I'm seeing them both show up, but one would traditionally be nested underneath the other one. And I see exactly what I'm used to from past versions of EF is a nice little API that says go create this table with these columns. This isn't tied to my model, so I could add in extra columns.
But you have not made the database yet.
Not yet, so I could edit this if I wanted to.
Okay.
I don't want to, it looks pretty good to me. To actually make the database, I use KEF migration apply, which will take any pending migrations, in this case just one, and apply them to the database. Now, I should point out in this workflow, I'm kind of doing the create my model, generate a database for me. EF7 totally supports the other model as well. I have a database, create my model for me.
If you typed KEF migration and hit enter, would it give you the subcommands?
I actually don't know if it will yet.
It should.
I'm not sure if it will, for sure. I'm not sure what it does.
Because it reminds me of, add, apply, list, script. Okay, so it's like Azure, VM list, and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's comfortable.
With an ASCII art unicorn.
I have to say I'm impressed, and thank you for carrying
Shout
that.
out to Bryce Lamson who built that for us.
Carrying that forward, Bryce.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a database here now. Everything we're used to, there's a migration history table. This records which migrations are applied to the database, and obviously we have a byte table that matches our CLR class. Okay, now obviously ASP.NET 5 is all about dependency injection, and everything should be registered in my dependency injection container. So let's go to startup.cs. In here we'll see in the default project template there's a bit of code already scaffolded out to kind of wire up everything entity framework. So we have some sugar methods on here which allow me to add a DB context. So I'm going to add in an instance of cycle sales context. This is basically registering my context in DI so that any of my components, like controllers or anything else, depend on this. They can have it injected as a dependency.
Okay, so and I don't do that via an interface. I would just simply have like a property called cycle sales context.
Well, this is a class. Oh yeah, typically a constructor parameter.
Okay, so I can do a constructor parameter, or I can do a property and say activate.
Exactly. Yep. Absolutely. And this is effectively just sugar. We'll get to config in a little bit, and there's some extra stuff you can do with this method, but it's essentially registering a scoped instance of this. So within the request, there'll be one instance of the cycle sales context shared across all the components just for the scope of the request.
Okay, so every request gets their own context.
Yeah, which is the pattern we highly recommend you do with Entity Framework.
And this is nice because this is by default.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. In fact, if you create the default project template with ASP.NET Identity, then you'll get a line like this for the ASP.NET Identity context.
Nice.
This means you don't have to worry about managing the lifetime of your context. Just ask for it in the constructor and you'll get it. All right, so we have an EF model. It's registered, but we don't really have any way to test it yet. So let's drop back out to our command line. And I'm just going to use scaffolding. So kgen controller. So I'm going to scaffold out a controller. I want bike to be the model class. And my DB context is cycle sales context. So this would be the same as right-clicking on the controllers folder and saying add controller. But a nice command line way of doing it. OK, so we've done that. Let's go open up the code it's scaffolded. So we'll see byte controllers now here.
Very similar as before.
Yep, absolutely. So a few things to tidy up here. At the moment, I'm creating an instance of the context within the controller, but that's not very DI friendly. So let's get rid of that, and we'll do exactly what we talked about. We'll create a constructor. We'll take in an instance of the context, which DI will give to us. And we'll just register that. And that'll be the instance of the context we use. Yeah.
Okay.
And then one other update I want to show you, just something that's a bit nicer now. If I scroll down, I'll see this line of code here. This was EF didn't really support an attach as modified pattern in the past. So you'd have to do this weird thing where you go through the change tracker, you look up the entry for the bike, and you set a state to modified. This is pretty ugly. So let's,
Why is that squiggled?
because our scaffolding's not up to date with our runtime, so
Oh,
it
okay.
should be this. Which was,
Do that again?
so just take out the change tracker.
I see.
We originally had entry hanging off the change tracker, but that's not where it was in EF6. So this seemed like one of those API ones. We'd probably move it to change tracker now, but that's where it has been in the past, so let's just leave it there.
Okay.